catastrophic Category 4 when it makes landfall in the state's Big Bend region. Storm Tracker Chief Meteorologist Jeff Banson is standing by with a look at our local forecast. But first, for more on the current conditions as Helene gets closer to shore, let's turn things over to meteorologist Christina Shalhoub in the Weather Center. Christina.
Things are looking pretty bad. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you and tell it like it is when it comes to not just Florida, but a lot of the southeastern United States. Because look, this storm is not only intensifying, but it's huge. This is hundreds of miles wide, and it is again an intense storm. So we're going to be really tracking this closely as it nears landfall, which should be late tonight. Let's talk about some of the stats about Helene. Again, massive and intensifying, now moving at 23 miles per hour north-northeast. That is speedy when it comes to these systems. It's also huge, and you don't often get those two things. You usually get a physically large storm that's kind of slow or a small storm that's kind of fast. This is both. That's not good. We also have impacts that don't end inland. They continue all the way across Florida, back into Georgia, Alabama, and eventually the Tennessee and parts of the lower Ohio Valley as well. In the state of Florida, 61 counties are under a state of emergency per the Florida government. And in Georgia, it's more of the same, the entire state under a state of emergency at this moment. Let's talk about some of the tropical cyclone threats that we see with just about every storm, but some of these aren't really recognized unless you've been through a tropical system. Of course, we have your storm surge, which is the deadliest threat when it comes to tropical cyclones. Of course, there's our hurricane force winds, flooding and flash flooding, but the one I want to focus on for a minute here is severe weather and tornadoes. Why on earth is that a problem? Isn't hurricane force winds enough? Well, unfortunately, not really the case here. Essentially, what you're getting is the northeast quadrant of a storm like this hitting the land, creating friction. That friction creates a thing we call wind shear. Difference in speed and direction as the winds go up through the atmosphere. That wind shear is a major ingredient with tornadoes, and that's why we're currently seeing tornado warnings in areas like Weehawken, Florida right now. And even as we head a little bit further south down the Gulf Coast toward areas like Venice, I-75, there's a tornado warning just brushing the edge there. That's going to last till 5:30 Eastern time. Again, it's not the only threat that we look for. There's that storm surge, which is the deadliest part of a hurricane threat. That storm surge with this storm, my gosh, is it big, 15 to 20 feet. And in case that doesn't necessarily register, again, it's hard to picture this if you've never been through a storm like this, right? Take a look at the Big Bend of Florida, where storm surge could get up to 20 feet. Imagine that storm surge, that wall of water being pushed ashore by the force of this storm up to the roof of a single-story home. That's the amount of water we're dealing with along the Big Bend of Florida and toward the nature coast. So that's why we're so concerned for our friends in this part of the country. If you have any friends and family in this area, look, the time to evacuate is really gone. It's all about hunkering down and making the most of any sort of shelter that you have at this point. Hopefully folks have either evacuated or taken the proper precautions. Something else I want to mention is on top of that storm surge flooding where we could have up to 20 feet of water and that wall of water coming ashore, there's also rain falling down, and not just an inch or two. We have areas that could see well over a foot of rainfall, and some areas have already seen well over 6 inches. So this is something we're going to be tracking really closely. I want to mention as the storm continues to move inland, thankfully the impacts for us here in the Northeast are not going to be anything like what the Southeast is getting. However, Jeff Banson, we are tracking the remnants of this storm coming into play in our local forecast.
Yeah, Christina, and we're going to get to that in just a second. Great insight on the storm right there by you. Some of the